Imagine being insulted in front of dozens of people just because of the color of your skin. This is exactly what happened to an elderly woman. She just wanted a smooth flight, but the arrogant flight attendant shouted at her, insulted her, and treated her with contempt. But what this flight attendant didn't know was that her husband himself was the owner of the airline. When he found out what she had done, well, revenge came in a way no one expected. The plane was about to take off. Passengers began boarding gradually, looking for their seats, placing their luggage, and preparing for the flight. Among them was an elderly woman with dark skin, walking slowly down the aisle, holding her small bag close to her chest. Her eyes reflected fatigue, but she possessed a rare kindness. She wasn't the type to complain or ask for much. All she wanted was a smooth flight to her destination. The flight attendant, whose name was Melissa, watched everything with a hurried look. She was known among her colleagues for her cold nature and impatience, especially with passengers she considered annoying. For her, seeing an elderly woman walking slowly down the aisle was enough reason to roll her eyes in annoyance. "Ma'am, hurry up. The plane won't wait for you." Melissa snapped sharply. The elderly woman paused for a moment, surprised by the hostess's rudeness. However, she smiled shyly. "Excuse me, my dear. My legs are a little weak. I'm moving as fast as I can." Melissa sighed in frustration. She didn't like excuses. She liked efficiency. Some passengers noticed the scene, but no one dared to intervene. They'd previously witnessed employees treating passengers roughly, and they preferred not to get involved. Finally, the elderly woman found her seat and tried to put her small bag in the overhead compartment, but her arms weren't strong enough. Before any passenger could get up to help, Melissa had already arrived. "Give this to me immediately," the hostess said, snatching the bag from her hand and throwing it violently into the compartment. The elderly woman blinked several times, shocked by the hostess's behavior. "Thank you, my dear." Melissa didn't respond. She turned around and continued her work, as if she'd done her a huge favor. A strange atmosphere settled over the plane. Many noticed the flight attendant's cold behavior, but they preferred to remain silent. No one wanted to create problems before the flight. The elderly woman sighed and settled into her seat, trying to ignore what had happened. She was used to being treated with disrespect throughout her life. She'd faced worse things, but she hadn't expected this flight to become an unforgettable moment. Not only for her, but for everyone on board. The plane took off, and the passengers tried to relax. Some were watching movies, while others fell asleep. The elderly woman gazed out the window with a calm face. Despite the flight attendant's harsh treatment, she didn't want to ruin her flight. After a short time, Melissa walked down the aisle, offering drinks. When she reached the elderly woman's seat, she didn't even bother to ask what she wanted. She just roughly placed a glass of water on the tray table in front of her. The elderly woman looked at her with a kind smile. "Can you give me a cup of tea, please? It would help calm my heart." Melissa sighed impatiently. "Tea? And then maybe a 5-star dinner? This is a plane, not some fancy restaurant." Some passengers turned around, paying attention to what was happening. The elderly woman lowered her head in embarrassment. "Sorry, my dear. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Melissa crossed her arms and laughed sarcastically. "Of course you didn't. You always show up like this, asking for things and expecting everyone to serve you." Silence fell over the plane. Everyone felt the weight of the situation. Some passengers opened their eyes wide in shock. Others couldn't believe what they'd just heard. The elderly woman blinked several times, unable to reply. "What do you mean by you?" she asked in a low voice. Melissa leaned closer with a mocking smile. "You know exactly what I mean." It was as if time had stopped. A couple sitting in the next seat stared with their mouths open. A man in the seat in front turned around angrily. "Hey, you can't talk to her like that." Melissa shot back sharply. "Who's gonna stop me? Stay out of it." The old lady took a deep breath, trying to hold back her tears. She'd faced prejudice before, but she hadn't expected anything like this during a flight. Suddenly, a young man sitting next to her stood up. "This is racism. You should be ashamed." "Oh, please," Melissa rolled her eyes. "These people always think everything is racist. Maybe if she wasn't so slow, she wouldn't have had to rush. Silence fell over the plane again, this time heavy, almost suffocating. The looks directed at Melissa were full of contempt and anger. Then a loud voice rang out from the back of the plane. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned at once. A tall man wearing a sharp suit was walking down the aisle. His face was serious. His eyes fixed on Melissa. She froze. Her heart pounded. She knew that voice. It was the owner of the airline. Even worse, it was her husband. Melissa felt a shiver run through her body. Her face turned pale. She'd never expected to see her husband on this flight. The man, Richard Carter, the owner of the airline, stood next to the elderly woman and looked directly at Melissa. There was not just surprise in his eyes, but disappointment. "Tell me I didn't hear what I think I heard," Richard said sternly. Melissa opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. She'd never seen Richard so serious before. He was usually calm and patient, but at that moment his expression was dark. The passengers exchanged glances. Some realized that this important man knew Melissa, but no one expected what would happen next. The elderly woman, who was still holding her cane with trembling hands, looked at Richard and smiled gently. "Son, don't worry. I'm used to things like this." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. How could anyone treat an old lady like this? And worse, his wife was the one who did it. He looked at the passengers around him. "Can someone tell me what exactly happened here?" A dam burst. Voices began speaking all at once. This woman was horrible to the old lady. She insulted her for no reason. She said racist things. She's been rude since the start. Every word was like a stab to Melissa. Her whole body trembled. She'd never felt so humiliated. Richard looked back at his wife. "I gave you everything. You work here because I trusted you, and this is how you treat our customers." Melissa tried to justify herself, forcing a nervous smile. It was just a misunderstanding. This lady is overreacting. Richard raised his hand, cutting her off. "Don't lie to me. I know you." Melissa felt as if her heart was sinking into an abyss. The passengers watched in silence, waiting for the outcome. Richard turned to the elderly woman. "Please forgive me. Nothing I say will undo what happened. But I want you to know that this company does not tolerate this kind of behavior." The elderly woman just smiled peacefully, making Richard feel even worse. "Son, what's in people's hearts isn't your fault, but thank you for your kindness." He took a deep breath, then turned to Melissa. His voice was firm and decisive. "You're fired." The entire plane fell silent. Melissa's eyes widened, and she felt the world spinning around her. "What? You can't do this to me." Richard remained unshaken. "I can and I will. I don't want my name associated with such behavior. You let me down, you embarrass the company, and most importantly, you hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Take your things and leave." Melissa began to gasp. "Richard, please." She looked around for support, but found only looks of condemnation. There was no one to defend her. With trembling hands, Melissa removed her badge and placed on the tray table in front of the elderly woman. Then, without another word, she walked down the aisle with her head hung low. As soon as she was out of sight, the passengers began to applaud. Richard turned to the elderly woman and gently took her hands. "If you need anything, let me know." She smiled and squeezed his hand tenderly. "Thank you, my son, but I've seen enough to know there are good people in this world." The plane continued its journey, but no one would ever forget that day.